So what is a portfolio? A portfolio can be done for a number of purposes. In the web world, often it's used as a way for web developers to showcase their skills. So let's Google web developer portfolio. At this one. Shoot. There'll be a link to it. Oh, there it is. Okay, notice we can get an idea of what this person's work is. We can see their graphic design. You can see a little bit of information about them. And you can see sample projects that they've worked on. Days of Poetry Gallery. Now keep in mind, I'm picking sort of high-end portfolios. I don't expect your portfolios to be this elaborate. But really, what portfolios are they're a way of you to say a little bit about yourself and to showcase your work. So if I was going to sketch a wireframe for it, it would probably look something like this. We have a header. We have a paragraph about you. And then I'm going to have a list of projects. Some text about it. Lab 1. Lab 2. Lab 3. One thing you're going to need to do is you're going to need to go back into your projects that you turned in and create a link back to the portfolio homepage. Now, let's mock up a very quick portfolio with a couple of the assignments that, or a couple of the examples that we done in this class. I'm going to download first week's example and the second week's example. So here's the first week's example. Download it and extract it. And the second week's example. Download it and extract it. I think I extracted it, yeah. No, I didn't. So here's my two folders. I'm going to keep each lab in its own folder. So I'm going to call this week 1. I'm going to copy this over and call it week 2. Now, each of these are going to have all the files that I need for it. So there's the files for week 1. Here's the files for week 2. Oh, they're shown over here. So I'm going to create my web page on the desktop. Now, in the interest of time, I have about 10 minutes left. I am not going to spend a lot of time making this look pretty, but you will. I'm going to go in here. I'm going to put my code in. Maybe here. I put a paragraph, info about me. And that should actually be some info about you. Then I have my nav section as a navigation to all of my labs. Now, this is going to be on the desktop. And the pages are going to be in different folders. That's the first time we've encountered that this semester. So we're going to make our links a little bit different. This page is on our desktop. So I'm going to save this as, on the desktop, I'm going to save it as portfolio.html. Now, where is lab 1? It's going to be a link, A equals href, but it's not on the desktop. Where is it? It's in a subfolder called week 1, and it's called first.html. So when I'm going down a folder, I put the name of the folder and then a slash. So I'm going to say week 1 slash first.html. Put my text, week 1 example. I'll do the same thing for week 2, except the folder is not week 1, it's called week 2. And the page is not called first, it's called index.html. You only have to link to one of your pages. You don't have to link to all of the pages if there's more than one. Now I'm going to save this. Now again, you're doing this. You're going to make this look really nice using all the CSS we've learned. Now I click on this. I forgot some tags. Got another LI. Click on that, I go to my week 1 example. Click on that, I go to my week 2 example. Now, I need to link back to the portfolio. So I'm going to have to go and change each one of my assignments. I'm going to edit that. I'm going to put a little link at the very top of the page. Or you could put it anywhere really, but. Now here I'm going to go up one folder. And when you go up a folder, that's represented by a dot dot. Slash, and then the name of the file. If any of you have had CISS 125, you use the dot dots the same way for this. Now you can go to Lab 1 and you go back to the portfolio. This is common. This is how we refer to different images. Images are in a different folder. We do the same way. We use either dot dot to go up a folder, or we use the name of the folder to go down to a folder. So if you wanted to have images in a folder called images, you would say image source equals image slash and the name of the image, instead of just the name of the image, which you would do. If you have any questions at all about this, please let me know or send me what you have so far. When you're done, you would zip up everything, portfolio, and all the folders for the class, and send to a compressed folder, and I'll be able to take that, decompress it, or uncompress it, or expand it, whatever the right word is, and be able to view your portfolio. All right, next week, the real fun in this class starts. We start playing around with layouts to make our pages really set up to be better designed pages and to more closely satisfy the needs of our users. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I will see you next week. I'll be in lab in a couple minutes. Okay, last time we talked about creating a project, and we talked about and identified the last two phases of the product were of the project definition, that is the project requirements, was to make a wireframe and to make a prototype. And I want to talk a little bit more about those two phases today. A wireframe is simply sort of a rough draft of what the basic sections of the page would look like. For example, if I were to draw this, a wireframe might look like this. Here's our page. We have our banner on the top of the page that says who the organization is, what the organization is, what the purpose of the website is. We might have navigation running across the top of the page. We may have content of the page. And then we might have a footer. And maybe this, and this is the same on every single page. And the only thing that varies is that middle content area. We see things like that in many popular websites, or many websites that are out there. If we go to Lorain Community College's website, we see that where the top of the page, no matter what page we go to, the top of the page looks the same. And also the bottom of the page looks the same. And the navigation looks the same. The only thing that's different is the middle section. So this is basically the structure that Lorain Community College's website follows. So you may have one wireframe per site. You could have a couple of wireframes. Maybe there's a different look for the home page than there is for the other pages, or maybe there's a different section of the site that looks a little different. Maybe there's a site, maybe that there's a few pages on your site where the banner's on the top, navigation is here, and you have a sub-navigation here. And then you have a content and the footer. Point is that you probably won't have a different wireframe for each page. All right, you probably will have one for what you're doing for your project. You might have one or two basic wireframes. All right, and all you're defining in the wireframe is where the basic sections are going. The next step is to turn this into a prototype, and prototype are actual web pages. So we're going to make web pages with CSS and to serve as an example that we can give. Now, why do we make a prototype? We make a prototype for a number of reasons. First of all, to sort of bring our design to life. It's a lot easier for a person to look at a prototype and decide if that prototype is good or not than for a person to look at all these sketches in a design document. They're needed, the sketches in the design document, to sort of document your thoughts and get you moving in the right direction. But a lot of times the prototype is what the user will use in identifying, is the website looking the way that we want it to. Remember, we want to detect any problems or oversights as early in the process as possible. So rather than waiting until we've completed the entire site before we show it to our client, we show it to our client after we've created some sample pages. And those sample pages are called prototypes. Now, those prototypes don't have to be finished, complete pages. They don't have to be polished. It doesn't have to have all the proper images or all the proper text that's eventually going to be on those pages, but it should be as complete as possible. All right, so how do we make a prototype? Usually what we do is, and I've done some of this in advance, I've created a bunch of prototypes here, is we make a basic template along with our basic CSS. So in our case, I made this template. This is for a hypothetical site where I am a travel blogger, let's say, and I am talking about vacation destinations. So I made this template. And we can look at the CSS for it, and we can look at the HTML for it. So I created it. I created it with my sections, and this is implementing the kind of wireframe that I had before, with the header on the top, the navigation, the content area, and then the bottom. Notice that there's not real text. There's that Greek text that I talked about before, which is just a placeholder text. All right. Now, let's look at the HTML and CSS for this and then talk about what our next step is after we've gotten this defined. All right, we have our standard doc type at the top. We have our HTML tag along with the head tag. In the head tag, we have our title, Vacation Destinations, which appears in the tab. we have our style sheet, and we have a link to this style sheet for Google Fonts. Google has a lot of fonts out there, and what we can do is we can actually use those fonts on our pages, and that's relatively easy to do. So if we want to use a specialized font, we can browse the fonts on Google, and we can pick a font that we like. Let's say we like this one. That might even be the one I use. I click on it, and it will show me what it looks like. Somewhere on here, download a zip file, and we actually get a font that we can install on our machine. That's not what I had thought we would get. What we actually get is we can get from this a link that tells us the font that we're going to use, and we just need to put the font family there. So in my case, I wanted the font Poppins. And all I have to do is put Poppins at the end of this where it says family. That's what I wanted to show. So that will allow us to use this Poppins font on our web page. I have my style sheet, and we'll spend a lot more time looking at that in a second here. And then I have my basic structure of the page. Now, if you remember our wireframe that I drew, I had a header, I had a navigation, I had a content area, and I had a footer. And that's the main HTML tags that we're going to use. I have my header here. I have my navigation here. I have a section, and in my section, I just have some placeholder text. Because again, that's not the final version of this. We're going to edit it on every page. So I just put something in here to fill it out so I can look at it and see if it looks correct. Then finally, I have my footer that's going to have the information. In this case, I have my copyright information, and I give credits to where I downloaded the background image. If you look here, the background image is that green sort of tile that we have here. So I've sketched out my main areas that correspond to the main areas on the wireframe: header, nav, section, and footer. All right. Now, most of our work now is going to be in the style sheets. In fact, all the different prototypes that I have, I'm using the same or pretty much the same HTML. I'm just changing the CSS code. Because what we're doing is we're taking this basic HTML framework and laying it out different ways using our CSS. I'm going to try to put everything in here that I want on every page. In other words, on every page, I want the seller's guide to vacation destinations. On every page, I want the navigation. On every page, I want the footer. I'm going to put all that in my template, because what I'm going to do is once I'm happy with my template, I'm going to clone this template. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to make my individual pages. So I'm going to get this right first, and then I'm going to copy them to be index.html, hawaii.html, iceland.html, and so on down the line. All right, let's look at the style for this. All right. And notice that the style, I am mainly styling the main elements of the page. So body, background image, background tile.png, font family, Helvetica, Arial, sans serif. So everything in the body gets these fonts unless I overrule it. The header section. Width is going to be 600 pixels. Margin is going to be 0 auto. That means that it is going to be centered. So notice that the width of the header doesn't get any bigger or smaller because I've set it at 600 pixels, but the centering of it changes because I've said margins 0 pixels auto. When you have a margin and you specify two numbers, you're going around like a clock. Because really you have margin at the top, you have a margin on the right, a margin on the bottom, then a margin on the left. So the first number is 0. It means that there's 0 margin at the top. The right is automatically generated. The bottom is 0 and the left is auto. And by auto, it means center it. Padding is 15 pixels. What is padding? Padding is the space between where the border is and where the text begins. So let's say I take out this padding of 15 pixels here. Things are sort of more smashed together. By putting in a padding of 15 pixels, I put a little bit extra space between the margin or between the border and where the text begins. Background white, text align center is going to center stuff within this. Border, solid, black, 2px. There's actually several border properties. There's a border style, a border color, and a border width. I can combine all of these into one border property and just say solid is the style, black is the color, and 2px is the width. The browser is smart enough to know that 2px isn't the color, right? That doesn't make sense. 2px only makes sense for the width. Black is not the width nor the style, it's the color. And solid is the style. So I can make this dashed if I want. And I'll get a dash border going around here if you prefer. Again, I could have done this border style, solid, border color, black, border width, 2px. Or I can combine them all in one border property that is set for all of these things. Border radius makes it more or less curved. So I have a border radius of 55 pixels. If I get rid of that completely, it's not going to be curved at all. It's going to be a rectangle at right angles. If I put it back in and make it 5px, it'll be a little bit curved. Might be difficult to see that. Let's bump it up to 15px. There's a little less curve than this one that's at 15px. It's at 55. So I could put that number in. All right, now's a good time as any to talk about the CSS Box Model, because I've used the CSS Box Model on this part. I've used several of the properties. The CSS Box Model works like this, that you can think of all the block elements on the page, and block elements are elements that are displayed on top of each other, like you're stacking blocks, you know, like header, like nav, like section, like footer. That all these boxes have a certain number of properties that we can apply to them. And those properties are like this. We have our box, and it has some content in it. Let's say it has the letters. Let's say if this was an H1, for example. There's several properties. The width of it is the width of the content. So it would be however wide this is. And in my case, I made it like 600 pixels. I could also define a height. I then have what's called a padding, and that's the space between the text, the content, and the border. All right. So this space between the content and the border is called padding. And then finally, the space between different blocks is called the margin. So we have those several properties that we can set. We don't have to set them, but we can set them. We can set a height, we can set a width, we can set a padding and a margin and a border. In other words, this doesn't equal, even though I made it 600, the total box takes up more space, right? It takes up 600 plus 15 on each side, that's 630, plus 2 on each side, that's 634. So this, if we look at it, this on the page, this actually takes up 634 pixels. So we're going to see those over and over and over again. Now, in addition to that, these properties of padding, margin, border, padding, margin, yeah, that's the three, can be set differently for each direction. Let's look at the border, for example. There's a border top. There's a border right. There's a border bottom. And there's a border left. So if I want to set the top border width to 5 pixels, I could say border top width, what did I say, 10 pixels? 10 pixels. Likewise, I could set the style of the border top. I could say border type style equals dashed or dotted or any of the styles. I could then specify a different width and a different style for the right, for the bottom, and the left. Or if I just say border style without specifying the top, bottom, right, or left, then it's all 4 directions. Likewise, if I give 2 values, for example, we'll talk about padding here, padding 5 pixels, 15 pixels, it'll do 5 on the top, 15 on the right, 5 on the bottom, 15 on the left. So it does that like on a circle. Now, you're not always going to remember everything in CSS. All right, how do you remember these different properties? Well, again, you look them up or you find a good resource. The one resource I recommend for students starting out is W3 Schools. So I can go underneath their reference for CSS and I can look for CSS border and it will show me examples. Border 5 pixels solid red, 4 pixels dotted blue, and double. Then it also mentions there's a border style, a border width, and a border color. You can either specify those separately, or you can specify them for each direction, or you can specify them for all. There's also tutorials on the W3 site that is sort of more information than just the reference does. If you want to look up CSS borders, show you all the properties that you can have for border style. Border width. And so on. Now, I mentioned before, and I used a quote from Spider-Man, that with great power comes great responsibility. You can actually set a different border, a different looking border on the top, bottom, right, and left. You can make them completely different. Why would I ever want to do that? I don't know. But if you have a good reason for it, then maybe you do it. All right. I could, for example, set a border on the bottom of something. Let's do that with the H1. The H1s I've defined as just having font family of Garamond serif. So let's look at our H1. Let's say I want to underline that. Another way of underlining it is I could put a border on the bottom. So I could say border bottom width 5 pixels. Border bottom style dotted border bottom color green. And I could save that and refresh. And there I have my border going along the entire H1. Point is you can do a lot. CSS is extremely flexible and allows you to control virtually every aspect of the design of the page. that needs to be held in check by what I would call a design sensibility. Sure, you can do it, but does it make sense to do it? And I would say in this example, no, that doesn't really add anything to the design, so I probably wouldn't do it, even though I can. So there's two aspects of using CSS. One is knowing how to do stuff. One is knowing when it is a good idea to do stuff. And when is a good idea? Well, to highlight things, to draw attention to a particular point of the page, to show that a different section of the page is somehow different from the rest of the page, and so on. All right, let's look at nav. Nav I have virtually duplicated. Margin 0 auto, padding 15, background white, text align center, border solid, 55 pixel border radius. And if we do that, we will notice that our nav section is styled pretty much exactly the same as our header section is. Now, what about the ULs? Remember, a nav section is typically a list of links. That's what our nav section is. A list with a bunch of LIs of links. So what I'm doing here is I'm changing the style on LI. First of all, on the list itself, I say list style type none. That gets rid of the dots before each list item. If I don't have this here, then don't see any difference. Well, that's what list style type dot is. I think some of these other styles get rid of the dots as well. Next thing I do is I make my list. Let's get rid of both of these. Now you notice the dots are there. I got rid of that. Now I'll also notice that I got rid of display inline. What display inline does is that makes it, instead of a block tag that gets stacked on top of each other, it makes it an inline tag that puts it in a line going across the page. And I've given them a left margin of 4 pixels. What happens if I have no margin? There's a small gap between them. If I give a bigger margin, I could put some extra space between them. Okay. Notice that I have nav, and I have nav UL and nav LI. Whenever I specify a selector this way, this means only the ULs that are in the nav section. Notice this UL is not in the nav section, and therefore it gets a different style. Same thing with nav LI. That means the LIs that are in the nav section. And finally, nav A means the links that are in the nav section. So this is a more refined way of selecting the things on our page by specifying, I don't want every UL. I just want the ULs in the nav section to be set up that way. Or I don't want every LI style this way. I just want the ones in the nav section. So I make the font size a little bit smaller. I give it a border, and I give it a very small curve. I give some padding. Without the padding, again, the text would be smashed up right up against the border. That doesn't look very good. Text decoration none gets rid of the underlining for links. Why would I do that? Well, I would do that because I'm already putting a border around the link. There's no sense having an underline too. And finally, the color, I give a background color of this shade of gray, and I give the color of the text of the links to be blue. I then have a hover pseudo class here that actually switches it around. It makes the background blue and the color white. So if you notice here, the link has a gray background, a blue text. Make sure we save it. Put the mouse on it, it becomes a blue background and a white text. It should be clear to anyone that has been on virtually any website that these are links because they look different. That's why we style things different ways, to show that different things represent different HTML elements. So I know just by looking at this that these are links. And if I'm still not sure, when I put my mouse over them, they change colors. That's an additional indication that this is a link. I could also do more things. I could make the font size bigger. It's a little bit bigger. An additional way to indicate that that's a link. So I didn't style it just because, I thought it would be pretty if these were a gray background and a blue text. I looked and I said, how can I indicate for sure that this is a link? And I do it by giving it a different background color and a different color. And I make it almost look like a button. Okay, section. Just about the same style rule as the rest, except I have the font family Poppins, which is from the Google API. And again, if you find a font family on Google, if you put this line in and specify the font name that you found on Google Fonts there, it will use that. So the section has that Poppins font to it. And finally, the footer at the bottom is styled about the same way, except the credits are a little bit smaller and the credits have a color of red. Now, two things I want to point out to this. This style rule here says dot important. Now, there's no such thing as an important tag in HTML. So dot important does not refer to an HTML tag. What does it refer to? It refers to items on the page that have a class of important. So this paragraph has a class of important. Maybe this is some important information about traveling outside the United States that I really want people to be able to see. So I give it a different class. I say class equals important. And then the style rule that I define for that class will overrule the style for the basic element. With a pound sign, that means use an ID. So this paragraph has an ID of credits. And here I specify the style rule for something that has an ID of credits. What's the difference between class and ID? You can have several things on the page with the same class. So I could have 5 or 6 important things on this page. All right, 3 or 4 important sections that I want to highlight. But there should only be one class having this ID. So I could have multiple things that have this class, but I should only have one thing that has this ID. This gives you more control. So I don't have to just style everything the same way within a section. I can set aside certain paragraphs or certain pieces of text or links or lists or whatever and give it a different style rule. So I could go in and say this UL has a class of important. And it will apply that style rule to it. Your class should be something that describes why that is a member of that class. Like, these things are important. I shouldn't give the class name something like red. Why not? Because what if I change the way I make something important to making it bold and bigger? I don't have to make important things red. I did. But I could also make them bold and bigger. And then the things that are important are bold and bigger. So the style should represent why you're using that class, or the class name should represent why you're using that class, and not the way that that class is going to look, because you can always change the way that it looks. Now, this is a very, very basic web design, but you know, it works. For many smaller sites especially, this works. Now, let's say I'm done with my template. I've looked at my template and I'm happy with it. I'm happy with the way it looks. I can then clone the template. By cloning it, what I mean is I can go and make a copy of that template. Rename it to whatever I want to rename it. Australia, let's say. And then I have my new page, and all I have to do is change this basic text in the middle. That's what I mean by saying that you should try to get the rest of the page, the stuff that's going to be on every single page, make sure that's right before you start copying that. Because if you decided, oh, wait a minute, I don't want to include Italy, I'd have to go back in all my clones and delete that line of code for Italy. And that just increases the amount of work. So make sure that the template, the stuff that's common to all pages, make sure you get that right. This section you're going to change on every page anyhow. And the CSS, well, you don't really need to worry about the CSS, because if I decide that I want to change it somehow, I look at this and say, well, wait a minute. I don't like that background image. Let's make the background purple, let's say. That page is going to be on every page. It's going to be purple. So I don't have to worry about this. All the things that we do, or many of the things that we do in software development, relate to making it easy to change, because we know that for whatever reason, we're going to have to change that. You know, maybe our company merges with another company and the color scheme of the organization changes. So we have to go back and change the color to match the new company's color scheme. Well, if everything is in the CSS file and none of the appearance is in the HTML file, then that change is easy to accomplish. All right, let me look at prototype 2 for a second to make sure it's what I think it is. Yeah. Same thing as prototype 1, but guess what? Section gets bigger and smaller when the windows get bigger or smaller. So 95% of the CSS is the same. What's different is in the CSS, instead of giving an absolute size of 600 pixels, I give a percentage. I make the width 75%. So if the page is wider, this is wider. So I could take advantage of the wide screen. But as it gets narrower, for example, if it were being displayed on a phone, it gets smaller. So it doesn't go as far across. So I do not have to horizontal scroll. This is the first phase of what we call responsive web design. And with responsive web design, you make pages that respond to the size of the browser window that holds the page. And that's a good thing. So I showed you how to do an absolute size of pixels simply because that's the easiest to do. But percentages are typically better. Now, when I say percentage of what, is that a percentage of? It's a percentage of whatever is inside, whatever this tag is inside of. So in this case, it's 75% of the body because the header is contained in the body. I can also put on a minimum width to say, I don't want this to get any smaller than 550 pixels. So notice as I make this smaller, it gets smaller up to a point. And then at this point, it doesn't get any smaller. Why? Because it hit that 550 mark, and I don't want it to get any smaller than 550. If I leave this out, it'll get smaller, and I just left it out on this one. It'll get really, really, really narrow. And I don't like that. I want it to stay at least that big. So I will give it a minimum width. All right. The rest of these prototypes we'll be talking about next time, along with a few others. But it would be good if you could review those in the meantime before next class. Prototype 3, for example, has this layout, another very common layout where we have a header, navigation on the side, our body, and then our footer on the bottom. This is another very popular sort of wireframe where we don't have the navigation going along the top, but we have the navigation going along the side. One thing you'll notice about these is that each of the different prototypes, we're starting with the same HTML. The only thing we're changing is the CSS. In this one, the navigation stays put even as we scroll. That's kind of neat. And finally, with this one, I forget what this one shows, but we'll review it next time. But spend some time looking at these additional styles and prototypes. And then next week, we'll have a couple more examples of this. Being able to have complete control of the layout with your CSS is a very valuable skill. So this is a very important section for you to understand and to start implementing in your homework assignments to get some practice doing that. Are there any questions? All right, we will see you next week then.